On the night of December 30th, 1610, György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, stood outside Chaktica Castle with a small group of armed men, knowing that what he was about to discover would either destroy the most powerful woman in Hungary or destroy him for daring to investigate her. Inside the castle, according to witnesses who had finally found the courage to speak, was a torture chamber where hundreds of young girls had been systematically murdered. The mistress of the castle was Countess Elizabeth Báthory, born of a family so powerful they were related to the King of Poland, the Grand Duke of Lithuania, and through marriage to the Hungarian throne itself. But power, Thurzó was about to learn, could not hide the smell of death forever. When his men broke down the door, they found a girl dead in the hallway, drained of blood. Another girl, alive but dying, her body covered in wounds. More girls in the dungeon, some still breathing, their bodies bearing evidence of torture that would make hardened soldiers vomit. And in her private chambers, the Countess herself, calm and imperious, demanding to know by what right they entered her home. By the end of the investigation, witnesses would testify that Elizabeth Báthory had killed 650 young women, making her potentially the most prolific serial killer in human history. But here's what makes this story even more terrifying. She almost certainly had help, she definitely had protection, and she may have been doing this for decades while everyone who mattered looked the other way. Chapter 1. The Countess of Blood. Elizabeth Báthory was born in 1560 into a world where her family name meant more than law, more than morality, more than God himself, at least in the parts of Hungary they controlled. The Báthory family didn't just have power, they were power. Her uncle Stephen Báthory was the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania. Her brother would become Prince of Transylvania. Her cousins commanded armies and governed provinces. In the complex web of 16th century Central European nobility, the Báthorys sat at the centre, spider-like, connected to every throne and every fortune worth having. Elizabeth wasn't just noble, she was untouchable, or so everyone believed. Her childhood at Exid Castle was marked by privilege and violence in equal measure. This was Hungary, in the age of Ottoman invasions, where noble children grew up watching Turkish raiders impale prisoners and hearing bedtime stories about ancestors who drank their enemies' blood. Elizabeth was educated. She could read and write in 4 languages, at a time when most nobles were barely literate. But she also witnessed public executions as entertainment, saw servants beaten to death for minor infractions, and learned that power meant the ability to inflict suffering without consequence. Some historians claim she suffered from seizures, possibly epilepsy, which in the 16th century was treated with everything from prayer to rubbing blood on the lips. If true, her earliest memories might have included the taste of blood as medicine. At age 10, Elizabeth was engaged to Ferenc Nadasdy, 5 years her senior, and heir to another massive fortune. The engagement was political algebra, combining 2 powerful families to create an unstoppable dynasty. But Ferenc wasn't just wealthy, he was earning his nickname, the Black Knight, by fighting Ottomans with a creativity and violence that impressed even hardened warriors. He was known for dancing with Turkish heads on pikes, for siege tactics that starved entire cities, for torture methods that made enemies surrender rather than risk capture. When Elizabeth married him at age 15 in 1575, she was joining a household where extreme violence wasn't just accepted, it was the family business. The wedding at Varano was the event of the decade, 4,500 guests, including the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian II. The celebrations lasted weeks, cost more than most countries' annual budgets, and established Elizabeth as one of the most powerful women in Europe before she turned 16. Ferenc gave her Chaktic castle as a wedding gift, along with 17 villages and their entire populations. She was now mistress of thousands of lives, with the legal right to dispense justice, including death, to anyone under her jurisdiction. In 16th century Hungary, nobles had almost unlimited power over their servants and peasants. If Elizabeth wanted to beat a servant girl to death, it wasn't murder, it was discipline. Ferenc spent most of their marriage away at war, leaving Elizabeth to manage vast estates and thousands of servants. This isolation, combined with absolute power, created perfect conditions for sadism to flourish. The first documented incidents seem like harsh but not unusual discipline. Servant girls who stole were beaten. Those who were lazy had their fingers broken. Those who talked back had their mouths sewn shut. By the standards of 16th century noble discipline, this was severe but not shocking. Servants expected beatings. What they didn't expect was for the beatings to become entertainment. The escalation was gradual. Elizabeth discovered she enjoyed the punishments. She began finding reasons to inflict them. A girl who brought water too slowly would be stripped naked and forced to stand outside in winter until she froze. A seamstress who pricked her finger and bled on Elizabeth's dress would have needles driven under her fingernails. A kitchen maid who overcooked meat would have her hands held in the fire. Elizabeth would watch these punishments with what witnesses later described as rapture. Her face flushed, her breathing quick, sometimes laughing, sometimes silent and intent. She was developing a taste for suffering, and she had an unlimited supply of victims. Ferenc, when he was home, either didn't notice or didn't care. Some accounts suggest he participated, teaching Elizabeth Turkish torture techniques he'd learned in war. One favourite was star kicking, placing oiled paper between a victim's toes and setting it on fire, causing them to kick frantically like a shooting star. He allegedly showed her how to beat servants in ways that caused maximum pain with minimum visible damage, useful for maintaining a workforce. Whether Ferenc was her teacher in sadism or merely an enabler remains debated, but his presence clearly didn't restrain her. If anything, his warrior culture normalized extreme violence as a tool of control. By 1604, Ferenc was dead, possibly from illness, possibly from wounds, possibly from poison. Elizabeth, now 44, was one of the richest widows in Europe, controlling vast estates and owing allegiance to no man. The servants noticed the change immediately. Without even Ferenc's minimal oversight, Elizabeth's sadism exploded into something beyond torture. It became systematic murder. She created a network of accomplices. Dorothea Sentes, known as Dorka, a woman with supposed knowledge of witchcraft, Ilona Joan Nagy, Elizabeth's childhood nurse, Katarina Benica, a laundress, and János Újvári, known as Fichko, a dwarf who allegedly acted as her clown and torturer. This inner circle helped Elizabeth industrialize her sadism. They would recruit young girls from surrounding villages, promising them positions as servants at the castle, good wages, and training in noble household management. Parents, desperate from poverty, and honoured that the Countess would employ their daughters, sent them eagerly. The girls would arrive at Chaktic Castle and never leave. At first, Elizabeth was careful. She chose orphans, runaways, girls whose disappearance wouldn't be immediately noticed or investigated. But addiction to violence is like any other addiction. You need more to achieve the same high. Chapter 2. The disappearances begin. The first girl whose name we know was Petra, a 12-year-old seamstress who arrived at Chaktic Castle in 1602 to serve the Countess. Her parents received one letter saying she was well and learning her craft. then silence. When they inquired months later, they were told Petra had run away with a travelling merchant, a shameful act that meant they should forget they had a daughter. The parents, peasants with no power to challenge a countess, accepted this explanation. They couldn't know that Petra had been dead for months, her body burned in the castle's massive fireplace. After weeks of torture that started when she accidentally pricked Elizabeth's finger while adjusting a dress, the pattern was always similar. Girls would arrive full of hope and terror at serving in a great castle. They would make some minor mistake, spilling water, dropping a plate, speaking without permission. Elizabeth would order them to the torture chamber, a series of rooms in the castle's lower levels, equipped with implements that went far beyond normal disciplinary tools. There were iron maidens, though not the mythical spike-filled coffins of legend, but rather iron cages where victims could be confined and prodded with heated pokers. There were whipping posts and chains. There were needles of various sizes, pincers, brands, and knives. But the most common tool was simply Elizabeth's own hands and teeth. She would bite chunks of flesh from girls' faces and arms, scratch them until they bled, and beat them with a heavy club until bones broke. The accomplices each had specific roles in this machinery of death. Dorka, the eldest and most trusted, would handle the severe punishments, the ones that might kill too quickly if done incorrectly. She knew how to maximize pain while keeping victims alive for days or weeks. Ilona Jonagi recruited new girls, using her grandmotherly appearance to convince parents their daughters would be safe. Katarina Benica disposed of bodies and cleaned the torture chambers, ensuring no evidence remained when guests visited. Fichko provided entertainment during torture sessions, mocking the victim's screams and sometimes participating in the violence despite his small stature. By 1604, the year Ferenc died, the operation had become routine. 2 to 3 girls per week would arrive at the castle. 1 or 2 per week would die. The official story was always the same. They ran away, they died of illness, they were sent to another estate. The bodies were initially buried in local churchyards with forged death certificates citing cholera or consumption. But as the numbers grew, this became impractical. Bodies were burned, thrown into the castle's waste pits, or buried in mass graves on the estate. Local priests who asked questions were bribed or threatened. Village officials who investigated disappearances were told the girls were criminals who had stolen from the Countess and fled justice. The torture methods, as described in later trial testimonies, were medieval in their creativity. Girls were stripped naked and thrown into the snow, then had water poured over them until they froze into ice statues. Others were smeared with honey and left outside for insects and animals to attack. Iron tools were heated until red hot and applied to genitals and breasts. Needles were pushed under fingernails and into lips and tongues. Some victims had their mouths forced open until their cheeks split. Others had fingers and toes cut off joint by joint. The Countess particularly enjoyed biting. She would bite off nipples, chunks of shoulder meat, faces until victims were unrecognisable. What made Elizabeth's crimes possible wasn't just her nobility, but the complete absence of protection for servant girls in 16th century Hungary. Servants were property in all but name. They had no legal recourse against noble employers. If a noble said a servant had committed a crime, it was accepted as fact. If a servant disappeared, authorities assumed they had run away. The few brave enough to complain were dismissed as liars trying to extort money from their betters. Parents who lost daughters learned to stay silent rather than risk their own lives challenging the nobility. The system was designed to give Elizabeth exactly what she needed: An endless supply of disposable victims, the local Lutheran pastor Andreas Báthory began keeping a secret record of missing girls after performing too many funeral services for young servants from the castle who had supposedly died of sudden illness. His list, started in 1602, would eventually contain over 200 names by 1610. But he dared not act on this information. Elizabeth controlled his church's funding, his living, and effectively his life. The most he could do was refuse to perform certain burial rites when the bodies showed obvious signs of violence, claiming the ground was too frozen or consecrated ground was full. These small acts of defiance were the only protest possible against a countess who owned everything and everyone around her. The villagers knew. They had to know. Too many daughters had disappeared. Too many screams carried in the wind from the castle on quiet nights. Too many rumours circulated in taverns and markets. But knowing and acting were different things. Some families started refusing to send their daughters to the castle, claiming they were already employed or had married suddenly. Others moved away entirely, abandoning ancestral homes rather than risk their children. But for every family that resisted, poverty provided 10 more willing to gamble their daughters' lives for the promise of wages and position. By 1609, Elizabeth had become careless or perhaps simply insatiable. The supply of peasant girls was drying up as word spread through the countryside that Choctich Castle was cursed, that girls who entered never left. Elizabeth's response wasn't to moderate her behaviour but to change her victim pool. She began recruiting from lesser nobility, impoverished gentry families who needed the connections and money that service to the Báthory family could provide. This would prove to be her fatal mistake. Peasant girls could disappear without consequence. Noble girls, even poor ones, had families who expected answers. Chapter 3. The Torture Years. The shift from peasant to noble victims began with Anna Welliker, a young woman from a declining gentry family who arrived at Choctich Castle in late 1609. Her parents had debts, needed connections, and believed that placing Anna in the Countess's service would restore their social standing. Anna could read, write, and knew court etiquette, skills that made her valuable as a lady's companion rather than a mere servant. Elizabeth initially treated her well, perhaps enjoying the pretense of normalcy that came with having proper ladies in waiting. But Anna made a fatal error. She witnessed Elizabeth torturing a peasant girl and showed visible disgust. That night, Anna became the entertainment. The torture of noble girls required more sophistication than what Elizabeth inflicted on peasants. Marks had to be hidden or explained. Deaths had to seem natural. The Countess developed new techniques specifically for her better-born victims. She would heat keys until red hot and press them into palms, leaving burns that could be explained as kitchen accidents. She would force girls to stand in tubs of ice water until they collapsed, creating hypothermia that mimicked fever symptoms. She would use thin needles to pierce internal organs through the navel or rectum, causing internal bleeding that appeared to be menstrual complications or stomach ailments. Anna Welliker lasted 3 weeks. The official cause of death was cholera, a convenient diagnosis since it explained the rapid deterioration and justified quick burial without allowing the family to view the body. But Anna had managed to write a letter hidden in her mattress and found by another noble girl, Ersi Majorosny. The letter described beatings, burnings, and being forced to eat the flesh of other victims. Ersi, terrified, tried to escape but was caught at the castle gates. Her punishment was public. Elizabeth wanted the other noble girls to see what happened to those who tried to leave. Ersi was stripped, covered in honey, and tied to a tree in the courtyard in January. She froze to death over 2 days while the other girls were forced to watch from the windows. The testimonies collected years later would describe a systematic hierarchy of torture that had developed by 1609. New girls underwent initiation, usually beatings with a wooden club until they lost consciousness. This established Elizabeth's complete control and identified which girls would break quickly versus those who might endure longer, providing more entertainment. Survivors of initiation moved to training, where they were taught to scream in specific ways that pleased the Countess, to beg using particular phrases, and to position themselves for optimal torture. Those who learned quickly might survive weeks or months. Those who resisted died within days. The Countess had also developed seasonal variations in her torture methods. Summer brought what she called fly time. Victims were covered in honey or syrup and staked outside for insects. Autumn was harvest season. Girls were buried up to their necks in the garden and left to starve or be eaten by animals. Winter provided opportunities for freezing tortures. Girls were stripped and thrown into the snow, or locked outside wet until they became ice sculptures. Spring was bleeding time. Victims were cut in specific patterns and their blood collected in basins. Whether Elizabeth actually bathed in this blood, as legend claims, or simply enjoyed watching it drain remains disputed. But multiple witnesses testified to seeing basins of blood in her chambers. Dorka, Elizabeth's primary assistant, had become an expert in prolonging suffering. She knew exactly how much blood a person could lose and survive, how long someone could be strangled before brain death, how many bones could be broken without causing fatal shock. She trained the other accomplices in these techniques, creating a staff of professional torturers. They kept detailed mental notes. This girl lasted 4 days without water. That one survived 60 lashes. Another endured, having all her teeth pulled without dying. It was a scientific approach to sadism, experimenting with human endurance limits. The sexual element of the tortures, while not the primary focus, was undeniable. Victims were always stripped naked, partly for humiliation, but also for what witnesses described as Elizabeth's fascination with young female bodies. She would examine girls intimately before torture began, commenting on their skin, their development, their reactions to touch. She particularly enjoyed torturing breasts and genitals, areas that caused maximum pain and psychological trauma. Some survivors reported being forced to perform sexual acts with each other while Elizabeth watched. Others described the Countess using various objects for penetration as part of the torture. Whether this was sexual gratification or simply another form of domination remains debated by historians. By early 1610, Elizabeth was killing at an unprecedented rate. Multiple witnesses would later testify that 3 to 4 girls were dying weekly. The castle's lower levels had become a charnel house. Bodies were stacked in storage rooms waiting for disposal. The smell of death was so strong that visitors complained, forcing Elizabeth to burn more incense and claim she was treating plague victims in Christian charity. Local gravediggers were paid triple wages to work at night, burying unmarked bodies in unconsecrated ground. One digger, Stefan Kozma, later testified he buried over 150 bodies between 1608 and 1610. All young women, many showing obvious signs of violence. The noble families were beginning to ask questions. Where was Anna Welliker? Why hadn't Ersi Majorosne written home? How did so many girls from good families die of sudden illnesses at Chachtice Castle? Elizabeth's responses became increasingly bizarre. She claimed the girls had eloped with soldiers, converted to Islam and fled to Ottoman territories, or joined convents under assumed names. When families demanded to see bodies, she claimed they had been burned to prevent plague spread. When they asked for death certificates, she provided forged documents with fake physician signatures. The Countess's own behaviour was becoming erratic. She would appear at social functions covered in scratches she claimed were from her cats. Her hands were often bandaged, allegedly from kitchen accidents, but actually from beating victims until her own knuckles split. She wore heavy perfumes that couldn't quite mask the smell of blood that seemed to cling to her. At a wedding in early 1610, she was seen laughing hysterically at nothing, talking to people who weren't there, and at one point, licking what appeared to be dried blood from her fingers. The noble families were no longer just suspicious, they were terrified. The tipping point came with Dorothea Gaethje and Ilona Hartzi, daughters of minor noble families who had been sent to Chakticha in summer 1610. Unlike previous noble victims, their families were connected to the royal court. When the girls stopped writing home, their parents didn't accept Elizabeth's explanations. They petitioned King Matthias II directly, claiming the Countess was murdering noble children. The king faced a dilemma. Investigating Elizabeth meant confronting the entire Báthory family, one of the most powerful in his realm. But ignoring dead nobles could trigger a revolt among the lesser nobility who supplied his armies and administration. Chapter 4. The Investigation. King Matthias II's solution to the Báthory problem was politically brilliant. He wouldn't investigate Elizabeth himself, but would authorize György Thurzó, the Palatine of Hungary, and coincidentally, Elizabeth's cousin, to look into the matter. This gave the investigation legitimacy while keeping it within the family, potentially allowing for a cover-up if needed. Thurzó was caught between loyalty to his relative and his duty to the crown. He began his investigation in March 1610, hoping to find the accusations exaggerated. What he discovered over the next 9 months would haunt him for the rest of his life. Thurzó started by quietly interviewing servants who had left Chakticha Castle's employment. Many refused to speak, terrified of Báthory retribution. Others had been paid for silence or threatened into it. But slowly, a pattern emerged. Former servants described girls arriving at the castle and vanishing. They spoke of screams in the night, blood on the walls, and the Countess emerging from her chambers, covered in scratches and bite marks. A former cook, Ilona Kovacs, testified that she had been ordered to prepare meals for dozens of girls who never appeared in the dining hall. A stable hand reported driving a cart full of what he was told were plague victims to unmarked graves, but plague victims didn't have torture wounds. The investigation accelerated when Thurzó received a letter from Pastor Andreas Báthory, the Lutheran minister who'd been keeping a secret list of missing girls. Báthory, perhaps sensing the political winds changing, decided to risk everything. He provided Thurzó with over 200 names, dates of disappearance, and his own observations of suspicious burials. He also revealed that Elizabeth had recently demanded he forge death certificates for several noble girls, threatening to have him replaced if he refused. This documentation transformed Thurzó's investigation from rumour gathering to building a legal case. Thurzó then did something unprecedented. He interviewed the families of missing peasant girls. Normally, noble crimes against peasants weren't investigated, but Thurzó needed to establish a pattern of behaviour. The stories were heartbreakingly similar. Daughters recruited with promises of good positions, 1 or 2 letters home, then silence and claims of running away. Parents who inquired too persistently found themselves facing increased taxes, eviction from their lands, or accusations of crimes they hadn't committed. The message was clear: forget your daughters or join them. The testimony of Susanna, a girl who had escaped Chakticha Castle, provided the most damning evidence. She had survived 6 months of torture before managing to flee during a fire that distracted the guards. Her body bore witness to her claims: burn marks, missing fingers, scars from beatings. But most importantly, she claimed to have seen a list in Elizabeth's handwriting, a record of victims that numbered 650. She had memorized portions of this list, providing names that matched missing girls from Thurzó's investigation. Whether this list truly existed or was exaggerated remains debated, but Susanna's testimony convinced Thurzó that immediate action was necessary. In December 1610, Thurzó made a strategic decision. Rather than arrest Elizabeth formally, which would require a trial where she could use her wealth and connections to escape justice, he would catch her in the act. He assembled a small force of trusted men, including 2 priests to provide religious authority, and planned a surprise inspection of Chaktici Castle. He timed it for December 30th, when most nobles would be travelling for New Year celebrations and unable to interfere. He also ensured King Matthias was conveniently unreachable, giving Thurzó freedom to act without royal interference. The approach to Chaktici Castle on that frozen December night must have been terrifying for Thurzó's men. They knew they were about to confront one of the most powerful women in Hungary on her own territory. If they found nothing, their careers and possibly lives were over. If they found what they suspected, they would be witnessing horrors beyond imagination. As they neared the castle, they could see lights in windows and smoke from chimneys. The castle was occupied and active despite the late hour. Thurzó ordered his men to surround the castle to prevent escapes, then approached the main gate with a small group. The guards, recognizing the Palatine, couldn't refuse him entry, despite the hour. As they entered the main hall, they immediately found their first victim, a young girl, dead, her body showing clear signs of torture. Blood was still pooling around her, suggesting she had died within hours or even minutes of their arrival. Another girl was found dying in the hallway, able only to whisper, "Help me," before losing consciousness. The smell of death was overwhelming. The search of the castle revealed a systematic operation of murder. In the dungeons, they found several girls still alive but in various states of torture. Some had been there for weeks, their bodies covered in infected wounds. Others were recent arrivals, terrorized but not yet physically harmed. In a storage room, they discovered bodies stacked like firewood, waiting for disposal. The torture chambers contained devices and implements that made hardened soldiers vomit. Blood stained the walls, floors, and even ceilings. Human teeth were scattered on the floor. Pieces of flesh were found in bowls, as if saved as trophies. Elizabeth was found in her chambers, dressed in white as if for bed, seemingly unconcerned by the commotion. When Thurzó confronted her with what they had found, she reportedly said, "You cannot understand the needs of noble blood." She showed no remorse, no fear, no recognition that she had done anything wrong. In her mind, she was simply exercising her noble right to discipline servants. The fact that discipline had become murder was, to her, a matter of degree rather than kind. She demanded to know by what authority Thurzó invaded her home, reminding him of their family connection and her rank. The accomplices were arrested immediately. Dorka, Ilona Jonagi, Katarina Benica, and Fichko were found in various parts of the castle and taken into custody. Unlike Elizabeth, they showed immediate terror, understanding that as commoners, they would face the full brutality of justice. Dorka tried to claim she was only following orders. Ilona insisted she never personally killed anyone. Katarina said she only cleaned up afterward. Fichko, the dwarf, claimed he was forced to participate under threat of death. All would eventually confess under torture to participating in the murders of dozens of girls. Thurzó now faced a crucial decision. He had caught Elizabeth literally red-handed with corpses and dying victims in her castle. Normal procedure would be to arrest her, try her publicly, and execute her if found guilty. But Elizabeth was a Báthory. A public trial would humiliate one of Hungary's most powerful families, potentially destabilise the kingdom, and definitely provoke retaliation from her relatives. Moreover, King Matthias owed the Báthory family massive debts. Elizabeth's execution would cancel those debts but also risk civil war. Thurzó needed a solution that would stop the murders, satisfy justice, but not destroy the kingdom. The solution to the Elizabeth Báthory problem was as medieval as her crimes. She would be neither tried nor executed, but simply erased. György Thurzó, after consulting with King Matthias II through carefully worded letters that maintained plausible deniability, decided that Elizabeth would be subjected to house arrest so severe it amounted to being buried alive. The Countess, who had tortured hundreds in her castle's chambers, would now become a prisoner in those same rooms, walled up with only small slits for food and air, left to rot in the darkness she had created. It was justice designed to avoid justice. No trial meant no public scandal. No execution meant no martyrdom. No official verdict meant the Báthory family could maintain the fiction that nothing had been proven. The trial that did occur was for the accomplices, and it began on January 7th, 1611, just 8 days after the raid on Chaktic Castle. The proceedings at Bitcha were a grotesque formality. Everyone knew the servants would be found guilty and executed as scapegoats while their noble mistress escaped formal justice. The testimonies extracted through torture were detailed and horrifying. Dorka confessed to personally killing 36 girls, describing methods that made the court scribes pause in their writing. She claimed Elizabeth would sometimes bite chunks of flesh from living victims and force other girls to eat them. Ilona Jo Nagy admitted to recruiting at least 50 girls for torture, knowing they would die. She described how Elizabeth would heap coins and throw them on the floor, then torture any servant girl who picked them up for stealing. Ficzko the dwarf provided perhaps the most disturbing testimony because he described the entertainment aspect of the murders. Elizabeth would stage elaborate torture performances, treating the systematic abuse like theatre. Girls would be forced to torture each other while the Countess watched, rewarding the most creative sadist with an extra day of life. He described Elizabeth hosting select guests, never named in the trial for obvious reasons, who would watch and sometimes participate in the tortures. These shadow figures, protected by their nobility, vanished from the narrative entirely, their involvement buried with the victims. Katarina Benika's testimony focused on body disposal, providing the most accurate count of victims. She testified to helping burn or bury at least 80 bodies between 1604 and 1610, but added that she only handled perhaps 1 in 3 victims. Many were disposed of by others or through methods she wasn't involved in. She described a pit behind the castle where bodies were thrown with quicklime, a mass grave in the forest that held dozens of corpses, and regular nighttime cart trips to dump bodies in remote locations. Her matter-of-fact description of industrialised body disposal shocked even the judges who thought themselves hardened to violence. The trial also heard from 13 witnesses, including survivors who bore physical evidence of their torture. One girl, Anna Zelenska, showed the court where her fingers had been torn off, joint by joint. Another, Katarina Praska, couldn't speak because her tongue had been split, but she wrote her testimony describing being forced to stand naked in freezing water while Elizabeth poured more water over her until ice formed on her body. The physical evidence was undeniable. These weren't accusations, but witnessed facts written in scar tissue and missing flesh. The verdicts were predetermined. Dorka and Ilona, as the primary accomplices, were sentenced to have their fingers torn off with hot pincers before being burned alive. The symbolism was obvious. The hands that had tortured would be destroyed before the bodies that had enabled torture were consumed. Fitzko, either because of his age, he was young, or because the court found his forced participation credible, was beheaded, a merciful death by the standards of the time. Katerina was initially sentenced to the same fate as Dorka and Ilona, but her sentence was commuted to beheading after she provided additional testimony about where bodies were buried. The executions were carried out on January 24th, 1611, in the marketplace at Bitcha. The crowd was enormous. Peasants and nobles alike came to watch Elizabeth's servants die for crimes everyone knew she had orchestrated. Dorka and Ilona went to their deaths, cursing Elizabeth for abandoning them, screaming that everything they did was on her orders. As the flames consumed them, they shrieked details of murders that hadn't been covered in the trial, names of victims not yet found, locations of bodies not yet discovered. The crowd listened in horrified fascination, knowing they were hearing truth that would never be officially recorded. Meanwhile, Elizabeth herself was being sealed into her fate. Thurzó ordered that she be confined to a single room in Chaktichi Castle, with masons literally walling her in. Small slits were left for food to be passed through and for air circulation, but no door, no window large enough to see through, no possibility of escape. She was to be fed twice daily, bread and water, occasionally some meat. But no human contact was permitted. Guards were posted not to prevent her escape, which was impossible, but to prevent anyone from communicating with her. She was to be erased from existence while still breathing. The legal fiction maintained was that Elizabeth was not imprisoned, but was in voluntary seclusion, praying for forgiveness for unspecified sins. No official charges were ever filed against her. No verdict was ever rendered. Legally, nothing had been proven against Countess Elizabeth Báthory. This allowed the Báthory family to maintain their positions and property while distancing themselves from their infamous relative. They made no attempt to free her, but also no acknowledgement of her guilt. She simply ceased to exist in family records, a non-person who happened to still be consuming food in a walled-up room. King Matthias II, however, wasn't satisfied with this arrangement. He wanted Elizabeth tried and executed, not for justice but for financial reasons. Her death would cancel the crown's debts to the Báthory family and allow him to seize her vast estates. He pressed Thurzó repeatedly to bring formal charges, but Thurzó refused, understanding that a trial would implicate other nobles who had known about or participated in Elizabeth's crimes. The web of complicity extended too far into Hungary's aristocracy. Pulling that thread would unravel the entire social fabric. Better to let one mad countess rot in solitude than expose how many had enabled or enjoyed her madness. Elizabeth survived 4 years walled up in her castle. Guards reported hearing her talking to herself, sometimes screaming, sometimes laughing, often reciting what sounded like names, possibly her victims, possibly her accomplices, possibly nobles who had shared her interests. She repeatedly proclaimed her innocence, not of killing, but of crime. In her mind, nobles had the right to do whatever they wished with their servants. The concept that murdering peasants was actually murder seemed beyond her comprehension. She had been raised in a world where her blood made her divinely superior to common folk. That superiority included the right to kill. On August 21st, 1614, guards passing food through the slot noticed Elizabeth hadn't taken the previous meal. They alerted Thurzó, who ordered the wall partially demolished to check on her. They found Elizabeth dead on the floor, aged 54, her body already beginning to decay in the summer heat. There was no sign of violence or suicide. She appeared to have died naturally, possibly from a stroke or heart attack. Her body was initially refused burial in the church at Chaktice due to her alleged crimes, but the Báthory family successfully petitioned for her to be interred in the family crypt at Exid, her birthplace. Even in death, noble blood protected her from the final indignity of unconsecrated ground. The immediate aftermath of Elizabeth's death was a systematic effort to bury the entire affair. Thurzó ordered all trial records sealed. The king, denied his show trial and financial windfall, agreed to let the matter die with Elizabeth. The Báthory family paid discreet compensations to some noble families whose daughters had disappeared, but officially maintained their relatives' innocence. The castle at Chaktice was abandoned, left to decay as if the stones themselves were contaminated by what had occurred within them. Within a generation, the specific details of Elizabeth's crimes were already being replaced by legend and rumour. Chapter 6: Truth versus Legend. The transformation of Elizabeth Báthory from historical serial killer to supernatural vampire began almost immediately after her death. The actual crimes, torturing and murdering hundreds of young women, were horrific enough, but each retelling added new elements until the truth became indistinguishable from fiction. The most persistent myth, that Elizabeth bathed in virgin blood to maintain her youth, appears nowhere in the trial records or contemporary accounts. This detail was added over a century later, first appearing in Laszlo Töröcsky's writings in 1729, where he claimed to have heard it from local legends. The image was too powerful to resist. A vain countess, literally bathing in blood, became the defining image of Elizabeth Báthory, even though there's no evidence it ever happened. The trial transcripts, when examined carefully, reveal inconsistencies that have led some historians to question whether Elizabeth was guilty of all or even most of the crimes attributed to her. The number 650 comes from a single witness, Susanna, who claimed to have seen a list but couldn't produce it. The actual number of bodies found was far lower. The raid on Chaktice discovered perhaps a dozen corpses and a handful of living victims. The testimonies of accomplices were extracted under torture, making them inherently unreliable. They had every incentive to exaggerate Elizabeth's role while minimizing their own. The witnesses who testified were either servants with grudges or nobles with political motivations to see Elizabeth removed. The political context of Elizabeth's arrest suggests motivations beyond justice. King Matthias II owed the Báthory family approximately 17,800 gulden, a massive sum that would be cancelled if Elizabeth were executed and her estates seized. The Báthory family controlled vast territories that other noble families coveted. Elizabeth herself, as a widow, controlled more wealth and power than was considered appropriate for a woman in 17th century Hungary. Her removal benefited numerous parties who had nothing to do with justice for murdered servant girls. The timing of her arrest, just as political tensions were rising between Catholic and Protestant factions, with the Protestant Báthory's representing a threat to Catholic Habsburg power, seems too convenient to be coincidental. Modern forensic historians have noted that many of the torture methods described in the trial were standard judicial punishments of the era, not exotic sadistic inventions. The Iron Maiden mentioned in some accounts wasn't invented until the 18th century. The descriptions of blood draining and bathing required medical knowledge and equipment that didn't exist in 1610. The sheer logistics of murdering 650 people in a castle without anyone escaping or reporting it for decades strains credibility. Even with accomplices, maintaining such a secret while hosting guests, managing estates, and conducting normal noble business seems impossible. Yet the evidence for Elizabeth's guilt in at least some murders is overwhelming. Multiple independent witnesses described similar torture methods. Physical evidence, bodies, torture implements, blood-stained rooms, was found during the raid. The accomplices' testimonies, while extracted under torture, contained specific details that match physical evidence and witness accounts. Elizabeth never denied punishing servants, only disputed whether she had the right to do so. Her own letters, discovered later, contain references to disciplining servants in ways that suggest violence beyond normal correction. Most tellingly, no one who knew Elizabeth personally ever defended her innocence. Even her own family simply tried to minimize scandal rather than prove her innocence. The question may not be whether Elizabeth was guilty, but rather the extent and nature of her crimes. She almost certainly tortured and killed servants. This was witnessed and documented. But did she kill 650 or 50? Were the murders sadistic pleasure or extreme discipline that escalated into murder? Were the sexual elements real or added by prosecutors to make the crimes more sensational? Was she a serial killer in the modern sense, or a noble woman whose standard violence was reframed as exceptional when politically convenient? These questions can't be definitively answered because the evidence was curated by those with interests in particular narratives. The legend of Elizabeth Báthory served purposes beyond historical record. For the Habsburg monarchy, she became a symbol of Protestant decadence and cruelty, useful propaganda in the Counter-Reformation. For the emerging middle class, she represented aristocratic excess and the need for legal reform. For the Romantic movement, she became a Gothic icon, the female counterpart to Vlad the Impaler, inspiring countless works of fiction. For modern feminists, she's either a powerful woman destroyed by patriarchal society, or an example of how women can be as violent as men when given power. Each era recreates Elizabeth Báthory to serve its own needs. The vampire connection, completely absent from historical records, has become so entrenched that many believe Elizabeth was the inspiration for vampire legends. In reality, vampire folklore predated her by centuries, and the connection wasn't made until the 19th century, when writers began combining historical figures with supernatural elements. Bram Stoker knew of Elizabeth when writing Dracula, but based his character more on Vlad the Impaler. The Blood Countess nickname, now inseparable from Elizabeth, wasn't used during her lifetime. She was simply the Countess, or in whispered conversations, that devil woman at Chachtice. What remains indisputable is that young women died at Chachtice Castle in significant numbers, that Elizabeth Báthory was responsible for at least some of these deaths, and that her noble status protected her from the justice that would have immediately befallen a commoner. Whether she was history's most prolific female serial killer, or a convenient scapegoat for a systematic problem of noble violence against servants, her story reveals the horrific inequality of a system where some lives literally didn't matter. The peasant girls who died left no records, no portraits, barely even names. We know Elizabeth's favourite foods, her clothing preferences, her educational accomplishments. We know almost nothing about her victims, except that they died in pain and terror. The ruins of Chachtice Castle still stand in Slovakia, a tourist attraction where guides tell stories that blend fact and fiction into indistinguishable narrative. Visitors come expecting Gothic horror and find it in stones that may or may not have witnessed the crimes attributed to them. The castle gift shop sells blood Countess wine, and replica torture implements. Elizabeth Báthory has become a brand, her alleged crimes commodified into entertainment. The real horror, the systematic abuse of power, the disposability of poor women's lives, the complicity of institutions in protecting noble criminals, is harder to sell than vampire fantasies. In the end, the truth about Elizabeth Báthory may be less important than what her story represents. She embodies the ultimate abuse of power, the corruption of nobility, the vulnerability of the powerless. Whether she killed 50 or 650, whether she bathed in blood or simply spilled it, whether she was a sadistic monster or a political victim, the fact remains that her story was possible. In 17th century Hungary, a noble woman could torture and kill servants for years before facing any consequences. That historical reality is more horrifying than any legend about bloodbaths or vampire countesses. Elizabeth Báthory may or may not have been the monster of legend, but the system that created and protected her certainly was. 650 young women. That's the number that echoes through history, whether it's accurate or exaggerated, whether it represents actual murders or the magnitude of horror that Elizabeth Báthory came to symbolise. But here's what should really disturb you. It wasn't the number that finally stopped her. It wasn't the screams, the disappearances, or the mass graves. It was the fact that she started killing the wrong class of people. As long as Elizabeth Báthory was torturing and murdering peasant girls, she operated with impunity for potentially decades. The moment she touched noble blood, even impoverished noble blood, the system that had protected her turned against her. Not for justice, not for the hundreds of servant girls who had already died, but because she had violated the unspoken rule that some lives matter and others simply don't. And that's the real horror of this story. Not the bloodbaths that probably never happened, not the vampire legends that definitely didn't happen, but the systematic indifference to suffering based on social class. Elizabeth Báthory was only possible because everyone who mattered agreed that servant girls didn't matter. She was stopped not because murder is wrong, but because she murdered wrong. She died walled up in her castle, never tried, never formally convicted, her noble blood protecting her even in death from the justice that would have torn a commoner apart. The system that created her survived her. The inequality that enabled her outlasted her by centuries. If this story kept you watching, if you need to know more about the monsters that power creates and protects, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Because history is full of Elizabeth Báthorys, people whose wealth and status let them transform cruelty into entertainment, murder into privilege, and horror into legend. The only difference is that most of them were never caught, never stopped, never walled up in their castles. They died in their beds, surrounded by wealth built on suffering, their crimes buried with their victims. Subscribe now and discover more dark truths about how power has always fed on the powerless, one scream at a time.